Welcome today to number 9 of our 10 ways to guard your heart. As y'all can probably remember, because we talk about it every week, we started this study based on Proverbs 4:23, which says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. You know, kind of the thought process is what's on the inside or internal is then expressed externally, and we want that to happen so people will see Christ in us. So far, this is what we've looked at. We've said number 1 was being an encourager, be forgiving, be truthful, be pure, be content, be humble, be spirit-led, be grateful. And then today, we're going to be talking about be watchful. So the first question that kind of came to mind, I was working on this lesson this week, and I kind of had it the way I wanted it. And then I thought, I don't know if I really even know what be watchful means. So what does it mean to be watchful? Is kind of the first question that came to my mind. And I think where we're going to start this morning is Matthew chapter 25, parable of the 10 virgins. So if you will, let's turn over there. Matthew 25, 1 through 13. We're going to read that and start there this morning. So Matthew 25, 1 through 13. While y'all are turning there, if you remember chapter 24 in Matthew, Jesus started to talk about his, quote, death and the destruction of Jerusalem and a lot of things that the apostles don't understand. In 24:36, he starts talking about the hour. 36 says, you do not know the hour. No one knows it, even the angels, talking about the second coming of the Lord. So he starts this conversation in 42 about, therefore stay alert, because you do not know what day your Lord will come. And then he transitions over into chapter 25, and he has this parable for them. It says, at that time the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of the virgins were foolish and 5 were wise. When the foolish ones took their lamps, they did not take extra olive oil with them, but the wise ones took flasks of olive oil with their lamps. When the bridegroom was delayed a long time, they became drowsy and fell asleep. But at midnight there was a shout, look, the bridegroom is here, come out to meet him. Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, give us some of your oil, because your lamps were going out. No, they replied, there won't be enough for you and for us. Go instead to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves. But while they had gone to buy it, the bridegroom arrived, and those who were ready went inside with him to a wedding banquet. Then the door was shut. Later, the other virgins came too, saying, Lord, Lord, let us in. But he replied, I tell you the truth, I do not know you. And then verse 13 is the key here. Therefore, stay alert, because you do not know the day or the hour. Now, this parable is talking about Jesus' second coming here. We're using this in a little different context today, but it kind of gives us the general flow, or at least it feels like to me, of what this thought process about being watchful is. Not just for the second coming of Christ, but how it impacts us as Christians, right? So when I thought about kind of what it means to be watchful, I came up with a few words. If you think about this parable here, paying attention was one that came to my mind, right? The virgins here paid attention to what might could happen. They were really paying attention to their stuff. The wise ones were anyway. Be alert, prepare, right? Or prepared would be one. Aware, focused, and awake. Those are some just words that I thought of. Anybody think of something that I missed that when you heard the word watchful, that just popped into your mind or came to mind? Vigilant. I'm sorry? Vigilant would be good. Anybody else? Intentional was one. That was one that came up multiple times while I was reading. It wasn't one of the things that I thought of right off the bat, but I think it's an excellent one.
Like being leery.
Being what?
Leery.
Leery. Yeah. So being a little bit cautious might be the word for that. Anybody else? So you kind of get the general idea, right, of kind of what this watchfulness is talking about here. But we're really talking this morning, or what I want to talk about is more along the lines of spiritual watchfulness. And spiritual watchfulness is living aware of my relationship with God and recognizing the dangers that could pull me away from him, right? So we've talked a lot in this class in the past about being pulled away from God or turning our backs on God. And I think spiritual watchfulness or being watchful is one of the things that we can do to keep that from happening. Now, the question is, why be watchful? Right. So if you think about some of the things we've talked about in the last year, one was grace, right? And we talked about grace and we talked about being covered by God's blood. And we talked about the fact that we don't need to be sitting around making checklists of things that we're supposed to do to earn our salvation. Well, when you start thinking about this being watchful, it's almost like, okay, well, I got to be watchful and I got to have a list. I got to be prepared, got to have a list, right? But when you think about this from the standpoint of what we're studying this morning, it really comes back to me to the difference between we have salvation in Jesus' blood, but then this watchfulness that we need to have is something that helps us recognize the dangers that could pull us away from Him, pull us away from Christ, right? Not pull us out of His grace necessarily, but pull us completely away where we turn our back on Him. And that's the thing that all of us as Christians certainly don't want to happen. And frankly, don't think it will happen. I don't know that any of us sitting here today say, well, I think that's going to happen. I'm going to turn my back on God. It's probably not the way we think about it. So I got a couple things here. So when you think about why being watchful, the first one to me is because we have an enemy. We talked about Satan quite a bit in this class. Our enemy is out there, and in 1 Peter 5:8, Peter talks about being sober-minded, be watchful, because your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. What do you think Paul meant here when he used the term sober-minded? What does that mean? I think we've talked a little bit about what watchful means, but what about sober-minded? I mean, what do we typically use the term sober for? Right, not drunk or not intoxicated. So what's Paul talking about here?
Clear-minded.
Clear, right? I like that word better. Clear-minded, right?
You're looking with goggles of reality on what's happening around you, because we know that He's constantly trying to get to us through whatever means necessary. So if we're clear with what's happening in our lives, then we're more likely to make better decisions and be prepared.
Right. And the world we live in today really doesn't set us up for that, does it? Typically we're busy. We've got other things on our mind. It's just kind of interesting. I told Chris this morning on the way to church, I've been really busy this week and haven't had as much time as normal to study for the lesson today. And what's so interesting is I found that less is more. Right? Most weeks I have so much information in my head. Y'all probably can tell it, because I'm jumping around and it's just rolling around in there. And I'm thinking, how do I get this out? And how do I get this out? This week, it wasn't that way, right? So I was a little more sober-minded this week when it came to my lesson, because I had to get it done and had to get it done a little quicker than I normally do. So I think it's this clear-minded. I think Rowdy hit it perfectly, right? We want to be clear-minded toward what we're doing as Christians. Now, the other thing to me that we want to guard against, which is maybe the most, in my opinion, it's probably the hardest thing, is that our nature, right? As human beings, we just have this nature about us. Watchfulness guards our hearts from spiritual apathy. So, we have a general tendency as human beings in general to get comfortable, right? And to let things just kind of flow, right? And so, and then from temptation, which we all know about, and then this thought process of spiritual drift, which to me is, when we get to it in a little bit, we talk about, it's probably the most important thing here. But honestly, spiritual apathy is the thing to me that starts the whole process. That's why it's first. That's why we're talking about it first this morning. So when you think about spiritual apathy, I could have used the verse in Revelations about the church at Laodicea, but I decided to use something different, actually, because I like this verse. Paul talking to the Romans in 12:11, and he says, "Do not lag in zeal, be enthusiastic in spirit, serve the Lord." What does zeal mean? When you think about zeal, we don't use that term very much, right? I don't know how many, I don't ever hear that term unless it's used with zealot, right? We might hear that sometimes. But to me, zeal, sometimes people get it confused with being happy or excited, or it's like almost a negative zeal. In my mind, I think zeal is more around the enjoyment of something. You're zealous about it. You enjoy it. It's something that you look forward to, versus just being excited about it one time. You win a state championship, you're excited. If you like to go to practice every day, in my mind, you're zealous, right? You like it, right?
I think it's like being convicted. Like there's an idea and you believe in it so hard that like you're all
Yeah, convicted would be another good word for it, I think. So, yes.
passionate.
Passionate's one that I thought about. Miss Mary Lee, do you have a comment?
Just think of that idea of zeal, that having that enthusiasm and enthused, doesn't that come from the having in God or have God or with God? Because of the older meanings. So as we keep that our focus, then that help us be zealous.
Yeah, so I think zeal helps us be sober minded. We're focused. That's a good point. So why is spiritual apathy dangerous? Is the thing that came to me, one of the questions that came to me this week. I think there's a couple things we probably could talk about a lot, but one, I think it hinders our spiritual growth. So if we're apathetic toward Christ or God, we're not going to be too excited about study or worship or things that we really need for our spiritual growth to be there. I think that's something that we all have to think about, because it's easy to be apathetic towards certain things, especially if they're not in your life all the time or they're not habits that you think about. But more importantly, I think that's why I said earlier that apathy tends to lead to these other two, is I think apathy is the trigger that leads to makes us more vulnerable to temptation, because we're apathetic. And then it opens the door to spiritual drift because we're apathetic, right? If you're going to drift somewhere, you probably don't really care at the point. You may when you get where you drifted to, but while it's happening, it may not be as much as we think. When we think about spiritual apathy, my question was, what does it look like? How does spiritual apathy look? And I think it looks like we could talk again about a lot of things. I've got 4 here that I just think came to the top. Going through the motions is one. This wouldn't necessarily just have to be spiritual apathy, by the way. This could be in your life in general. Worship becomes a burden. You kind of think more about worship as an obligation. I'm not necessarily talking about the services of worship. That is one portion of that. But I just think worship in general. I was reading this week a little bit about drifting and drifts and apathy, and it was talking about how we've gotten so used to things in nature that are really glorious, like sunrises. I mean, that's a little cheesy, but I'm just saying, we have a tendency to let those kind of fall by the wayside, right? Because they happen every day, right? So it just kind of becomes routine to us. We don't think about worshiping God in those moments for those things. We have a tendency to pigeonhole worship into the gathering of the saints, if you will. No desire to grow. So when you think about it, we talk about this in a little bit, but when we have classes or Spencer speaks about this and we talk about spiritual growth, what's the thought process that happens there? Is it like, I'm good enough, I'm not really worried about it? You kind of got some apathy going there. And then mistake routine for faithfulness. This was one when I read this week, I didn't know if I was going to put it in there or not. And then I thought, yeah, it makes sense, right? You end up thinking about these routines that we go through, and we assign faithfulness to that instead of what we're actually supposed to be doing for faithfulness.
Well, Kelly, when it comes to apathy, I think we've got to understand, we were talking last week about that idea of a line, one being on one end, one being on the other. I kind of see this here. Those first 3 to me are kind of that. Those are apathy, but they're the end of apathy. We got to be aware that there's so much in between. I think about my mother. When I grew up, I never once asked the question, never once in my entire childhood, are we going to church? Never one time, because I knew the answer to that, right? So yeah, worship becomes a burden, but we also have to be aware that there's a whole plethora of things that comes prior to that we've got to be watchful for, because that is kind of where we realize, oh no, where am I at? But what happened prior to that we missed?
Yeah, for sure.
There's a whole spectrum.
Yeah, I agree. I read this. I didn't come up with this one. I read this one this week, but I thought this was pretty good because, you could get confused about apathy a little bit if you're not careful. spiritual apathy is not abandoning your faith, right? It's something that happens over time, and it's really allowing your I like that word better. I wish I'd have used that here. Your intentionality, if that's a word, toward God, right? How are you being intentional toward him versus letting it slowly fade away? It's interesting to me because you would think just automatically as we get older and mature as Christians, that we would get closer to God. You would think that would be the case. I don't know if that is always the case. I mean, for me, sometimes it seems better than others. Right? So let's talk about temptation a little bit. Temptation. So James chapter 1, 13 through 16. Let's turn over there right quick. I just want to read this one real quick. It's probably one of the most popular verses when it comes to temptation. So James 1, 13 through 16. And he says here, James says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself tempts no one. That should be good news to us, right? It should also be something that we think about when we're in temptation. I don't know if you guys have ever done this, but I've done this before. When we're tempted, we're almost like, God, why you let this happen to me, right? But it's kind of interesting there. And then go on, but it says 14, but each one is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. Then when desire conceives, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is full grown, it gives birth to death, which is what we're talking about here today, which would be turning your back on God. And it says, do not be led astray, my dear brothers. The verse that I think is interesting is 14. We've talked about this in this class before. We're tempted when our desires, right? Our desires entice us, right? We're lured by that. It's either the NIV or the ESV, I can't remember which one, uses the terminology drags us away. I love that, to think about that visual, right? But when you think about being enticed, I was thinking about this yesterday when thinking about what does that mean? Like we don't use that word very much, really, right? You think about something that entices you, you have a desire, you see something, a possession, a person, a whatever that you're attracted to, let's say, and then there's this enticement, right? That enticement typically leads to some kind of thought about an action. Triggers? Yeah, trigger, like a trigger, right? And it might be that, that text, right? That you think, it's not that bad, right? But you're enticed, right? Because that desire is there. And you internally somewhere you want it to lead to some kind of action. And then desire, it conceives, it gives birth to sin. So that's how we get to that sin, right? So the temptation's got to be taken care of before then. I thought about this. I make fun of myself on this one all the time, but to put guardrails some way around our temptations is to me the watchfulness thought. I was thinking about car lights. I know the fences that people put out for their dogs, and they have a little collar on them, and it's invisible. And when you get too close to it, it shocks you. That's what they needed, a car light for me, and I need the collar, right? So I can't get in, right, instead of getting out, right? Because that's what it just entices me. If I go in to a car light, I just get enticed, right? So temptation. You think about 1 John, what he says about this. Everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, it comes from not from the Father, but from the world. Most everything we do could fall into one of these three buckets. And I think when we think about that, it really makes this watchfulness thought process very important, right? Yes, ma'am.
When you look back at watchful and the definitions you were given, it strikes me as being anxious, not in a fearful anxious, but if you're truly anxious about something, if your kids, if you plan a trip with your kids and they're really looking, they dwell on it a lot. And if we're anxious to go to heaven with God, being anxious to go and do that is going to help fight all these other things off.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe even the word hopeful, maybe. Good comment. Anybody else? So when you think about this thought process of temptation, we just read this, but we're lured and enticed by our desires. We're not, in my opinion, we're not gonna not have desires, right? So we need to admit that right out of the gate, right? and we're going to be lured. We're going to be enticed by that. That's why we've got to be able to recognize them to be able to do something about it before it gets too far along. Desire leads to sin. Sin leads to death. And the way I thought about this week is it's kind of the three things that John talks about in First John is really it comes down to passion. Somebody's already mentioned that, but passion, possessions, and glory. Right? Lust of the flesh, passions, lust of the eyes, possessions, lust of pride of life is glory. We want those things. We have a general tendency to want those things. I think it's something that we really need to be watchful about. Watchfulness can help us recognize temptation earlier, is the final thought about temptation. Anybody got any thoughts or comments about temptation? All right, so the next one's the one that I really want to spend some time on here, spiritual drift, because I think this is one of those things that none of us would intend to do. There's nobody that would have the intent to do this, but I think we could look around today, just in our class, and probably name half a dozen folks that aren't here today that maybe had an issue with this. I don't know if that was their issue, but maybe is their issue, right? And so you think about spiritual drift. Hebrews 2:1 says, therefore we must pay closer attention to what we have heard so that we do not drift. So this word that we have is one of the most important things for us in our fight against spiritual drift. We need to learn from what we hear and we need to pay attention to it, right? When you think about spiritual drift, this is some of the things, it rarely happens fast, right? I mean, I think about that just in my own life, how things that are gradual, how you end up waking up one day and it's like, how did I get here? You know, I mean, it could be health, it could be whatever, right? And it just happens to us, right? So it rarely happens fast. This is one for me that I think is interesting. We get comfortable, right, as in our situations, and then our anchor slips. You know, most of the visuals or anything you read about drifting always wants to use a boat. You know, it's like you're in the lake, you have a boat, you know, you're not paying attention, before you know it, you're 150 yards away. And that's fine. I have a little bit of a personal, not a little bit, it is a personal story about this. You know, we were in the seed business, as y'all know, and we got in the corn seed business. And I was told from day one, the very first thing somebody sat me down and said is you have to manage your dead and obsolete corn inventory. So that inventory is inventory that can't be sold anymore. So you just have to get rid of it. And it's really expensive. It can break companies, right? It's done that to multiple companies. And for the first 10 years we were in business, I was very intent about watching that. And then we got really busy. We started expanding. I had other people that were involved in those things, and my anchor slipped. And then I'm in a meeting with my corn production manager and my sales manager in 2013. And they show me we've got $3.5 million worth of corn inventory that we're probably not going to sell. Okay. It was not a good day. Right. Christy can tell you, I went home, slept from about 3 o'clock one afternoon till about 10 o'clock the next morning. Had a little meltdown, right? But that was because of my drifting, right? It took 3 or 4 years for that to happen, but I was busy with other stuff. And it was important stuff. It wasn't dumb stuff. We were adding sales reps here and doing this and doing that. But I had lost my anchor that I had been told, you know, you got to take care of this dead, not obsolete inventory. So we got to be careful about that. We can't get comfortable. And then make gradual compromises is one of the things we've talked about in other lessons here. I think we all know what that means. Question I have for you this morning, because I asked myself this, do you ever think about spiritual drifting? Is that something that any of us really think about? You know, I'd say we don't think about it a whole lot. You know, we don't preach about it much. We don't talk about it much. You know, I think it's because that's something that if we're not careful, we can get comfortable with. I'm thinking, well, I'm not going to be the one that spiritually drifts. That's not going to happen to me. So I think that's one of the things we really need to be careful about. I think watchfulness is one of the things to be thinking about here. We need to self-check every now and then. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So how do we recognize it? That's what a question for me is. Like if a person was drifting, how do we recognize these things? And I think one of the first ones would be you begin to depend on yourself more than God. What's your prayer life look like? How do you think about things that you've accomplished? Is God involved in those, or are you thinking more about yourself than you are more God? Christian relationships become less important. Now, this one to me was I was like, why would that happen? Right? Why would I want my Christian relationships to become less important? Well, if I was drifting, would I want somebody holding me accountable for that? It'd be a whole lot easier if I didn't see Spencer, right? Yeah. Or Deb. Yeah. I mean, it's just, I think it would become less important to us probably because of the drifting, right? So we need to recognize that. We become more influenced by culture than scripture. I think it's a big deal these days, y'all. I don't like hammering on this stuff a lot because I don't want to be that person that says, "Oh, the way it was back when I was a kid." You know, I don't want to be that person. But I really think if we examine the world we live in today, this is becoming more and more and more prevalent every single day, right? We're asked to adhere to culture and not scripture publicly, I would call it, right? We may still have us. Now, I'm going to tell you, this one's not easy, right? It's not easy. It's very difficult. As a matter of fact,
But why is it difficult? It's difficult because you've got to constantly be questioned. Am I doing what I need to do? Am I where I need to be? And it's not an easy thing to do.
I think also it's not easy because of ridicule or the cancel me culture. I don't know if that's still around, but it used to be, right? If you disagree with someone that's in culture and you were to use scripture for that, you'd just get destroyed, right? I mean, literally just destroyed. So I think we all have that in the back of our mind. None of us want to be argumentative and be nasty and hateful. We want to be able to do it right, but you almost can't do that in some scenarios these days. Worship becomes routine. We've already talked about that a little bit, and I'm not just picking on worship services there. I'm talking about during your prayer life. You know, what's that feel like, right? Is there part of that that's worshiping God for how mighty He is and the majesty that He has? It's you know, if we're not careful, we can let that stuff become a little cheesy if we're not careful in our mind. It's not, but we can let it become that way, right? Because it's just something that I think culture, again, the world doesn't see it that way. They just think the sun comes up every day, right? That's the way it works. Sin bothers you less than it used to. That's an interesting one. Small compromises become acceptable. We've already talked about that a little bit. So a heart that isn't watched. So this thought process about watchfulness, watching our heart, it will eventually drift if we're not watching it, right? It may not drift all the way to the spot where we didn't want it to, but you guys all know this. When you stop watching something, there's just a little tendency for things to go one way or the other. I mean, it doesn't necessarily always have to be negative, I guess, but you just drift. You know, if you think about driving, you know, I don't know how many of y'all read the story about the San Francisco 49ers football coach had a wreck last week, and he was in a car and he dropped his phone. It wasn't on his phone, but it was in his lap and it fell in the floor. And he looked down for 2 seconds. They measured it 2 seconds, and he drifted into the next lane and hit a lady head on. He almost put his eye out, but it was drifting. He was drifting, right? He took 2 seconds off, and he's in the other lane. I think it's a real good example of it. So, all right. So, anybody got any questions before we get into this fun stuff about a drifting assessment? Okay. So, if you think about it, there's 4 things here. These, I didn't come up with these. I looked through a ton of these, trying to come up with 4 that I thought would work fairly well for us. So you think about, am I closer to Christ today than I was a year ago? And what does that look like? I mean, the answer could obviously be yes, without the answer really being yes, if we're not measuring it in some form, right? So what does that look like? You know, am I closer today? 2, is God's word shaping my daily decisions? Not culture, it's the word, right? 3, am I becoming more like Jesus in how I love, forgive, and serve, or not? And then 4, if nothing changed in the next 5 years, would I become the Christian I hope to be? I left the word hope in there. I really wanted to use the term need to be, but I left hope in there, right? So these 4 things to think about. So this morning, key takeaways from the lesson this morning. When you think about spiritual apathy, right, it hinders our growth. There's no doubt about that. But watchfulness helps us measure our zeal and enthusiasm for Christ, which is a really big deal, right? So being watchful about that, measuring that. 2, temptation entices us with our own desires. We can blame other people for them, but at some point we gotta make the realization that it's us and not them. Watchfulness helps us recognize temptation much earlier. And I don't know about y'all, but the earlier I recognize a temptation, the easier it is to fight. The further it gets along, the harder it is. And then finally, spiritual drift is slow, right? And it takes us further than intended most of the time before we realize it. And watchfulness helps us realize our anchor is slipping before we drift further than we intended. And that anchor is such a big deal in the Christian life. So spiritual apathy hinders our growth, temptation entices us with our own desires, and spiritual drift is slow and it takes us further than we intended. Anybody got any final thoughts or any comments they want to throw out? It's pretty a heavy lesson, but
Kelly, I think if we think about it as growth,
I think so too.
because the fact is, a plant, and we all realize this, a plant is either growing or it's dying. There is no in between.
Correct.
That plant is either getting stronger, bigger, producing, or it is dying. And if we can think of our spirituality, I think it brings that intent, that thoughtfulness. Everything we do either helps us to grow or it helps us to die.
I agree. And one of the things to think about in this lesson today is not, again, we have to go tomorrow and figure it all out and be the way we're supposed to be tomorrow. This is a gradual situation over time. We've got to think about growth and we've got to do it over time. Right? It's just the way it works, right? So closing thought here is a spiritual watchfulness is an awareness that keeps us close to God, which I think is a really big deal, y'all. This being close to God. We need to be as close as we can to Him and protects us from slowly drifting away from Him is the intended thought there. So our weekly challenge this week, it's really simple. Just do a self-assessment for apathy and drift. Don't beat yourself up over it. We all got some of it in our life. I can promise you it's the way it works, but just have a little self-assessment about it and then think about how you can change that or turn it to a different thought process. So next week, we're going to talk about being rooted in the Word. Chris is going to teach that lesson, and that's going to be number 10. And we have not had one interruption this quarter, which blows my mind. And so we'll have a couple weeks left. So we'll come up with something that ties all this together, maybe have some conversations around what we've talked about. Okay. So I appreciate y'all's attention this morning, and I hope everybody has a really good week and good luck. Hey, she's on her way to college this week, y'all.